Hey, this is Jennifer Walden. Welcome to Mix's special award season coverage. We're talking about the sound of Netflix's The Midnight Sky. And I am joined today by two-time Oscar-winning supervising sound editor, re-recording mixer Randy Thom, and Emmy-winning re-recording mixers Todd Beckett and Dan Hiland.
Great to be here. Thanks.
So this film combines an apocalyptic extinction event on Earth with a sci-fi space adventure. In terms of sound, how were you able to create sounds that fit each side of the story, but still feel like they belonged in the same film?
Wow, I wish I knew. I'm still working on figuring that out. Yeah, it was a challenge for sure. And, you know, every film is different. You never know exactly how you're going to do it when you start, and the only way to figure it out is to just start experimenting and trying things and playing them, in this case for George, getting his feedback. And in terms of space, we felt like we didn't want to go quite as far as the movie Gravity, which George, of course, was an actor in terms of strictly obeying the laws of physics, where you don't hear anything at all if you're out floating in space. But we wanted to tip our hats to it. And so, you know, at some point I can talk about how we approached the sounds outside the spaceship. And in terms of the terrestrial sounds, George did mention that he was a fan of The Revenant, which I worked on a couple of years ago. And there are certainly some parallels stylistically and story-wise between that film and Midnight Sky. Certainly, sense of isolation, etc. And so I had that in the back of my head as I was figuring out which sounds would be appropriate and how to process them.
Let's talk about the design and mix for some really interesting sequences in this film. First, let's look at the scene in which Augustine and the little girl Iris, they come across this downed plane on their trek to the weather station. How did you use sound to help build the tension in that sequence?
Wind, I would say, helped us a lot in that sequence. The fact that you see things, pieces of the airplane blowing in the wind, allowed us to justify a kind of musical sound effects treatment where you hear various kinds of rhythmic tapping as a shard of metal is banging against something else on the edge of the plane, perhaps, even though you never actually see that specific action. And that does a couple of things. That kind of sound is inherently kind of mysterious, and it suggests terrible violence as the plane crashed, but it also gives you the opportunity to establish a kind of rhythm. And that's what this tapping is about. And then as the Augustine character discovers this very, very sick guy inside the airplane, then that rhythm suddenly stops. And it's one of the things that tells you that something very important has just happened.
Also, I think it's the contrast that we were able to play between the outside and the inside. We started out full and basically followed George into the plane. And as we did, once we got into the plane, really pulling the sound back. So you kind of had to lean in to see what was going to happen. And then, of course, Todd, perfectly just dialed the backgrounds down and out as just closer to we got in with George and the other character. And then basically down to as little as you can have before the gunshot kind of brings you back out and back into the rest of the picture then.
Yeah, I definitely felt myself holding my breath in that sequence, like what's gonna happen.
Yeah, so. It's really about being minimal there and keeping it real low and just real quiet. And quiet plays a big part in this movie, and it's always really effective when you're able to use it.
Todd, anything to add about the mix of that sequence?
Yeah, they've hit it. It was all about having things to take away. And of course, that's sometimes very difficult because it can be a little gimmicky, maybe if you're not sort of subtle about it. But certainly that was the intention, is to start large and wide, and then slowly, as you get down into the plane towards that sick man, you're really drawn in, almost in the absence of everything except for the score, of course.
Shortly after that, Augustine and Iris, they find an abandoned shelter on the ice. They're sitting at the table inside, and it's the first time that we hear Iris speak. And then suddenly, Augustine, he wakes up in a puddle of water, and they have to escape the sinking shelter. In terms of design, how were you able to have some fun with the sound in that sequence?
Well, ice breaking is always fun because it gives you the opportunity to use, dynamics and tonal elements. And ice breaking can be very subtle, and it can be very frightening. And there was room for both of those kinds of sounds in this sequence. The sequence really begins with a shock as Augustine awakes from a dream to realize that the shelter they're in has been, punctured somehow, perhaps by the ice, and water is rushing in from this, frozen lake that the shelter is presumably sitting on. And we begin to hear the ice breaking all around that structure. And it was fun for us to play with, close ice breaking sounds and distant ice breaking sounds, and really build the dynamics in the scene. So you go from dead quiet just before that sequence happens to very, very intense at the end.
And it's really in that sequence as well. That was one of the trickiest balances. You almost have to take it shot by shot as far as what you feature, because clearly, the score's trying to play the whole sequence, and sound effects has design that plays the whole sequence, and it just comes down to going over and over and over and finding the right place for a creep to come through, or the right place for nothing to happen, and let a piece of the music play that triggers something. And it was really a lot of just back and forth of all of us trying to figure out what played in what spot to keep the pace of it going from the time he wakes up until obviously the time he comes out of the water. That pace varies in there quite a bit. And it was, that was mix wise, really one of the trickiest scenes of just trying to get everything to follow and work together.
Yeah, Todd and Dan did a wonderful job of orchestrating that sequence, because mixing a sequence like that is really all about focusing on one set of sounds, then the next set of sounds, and the next set of sounds, whether it's sound effects or music or dialogue. But you need to do it kind of gracefully enough so that it seems like, if you're an audience member, you're hearing everything you're supposed to be hearing, but really what you're hearing is this very carefully orchestrated sequence.
And how are you able to use the sound field in that sequence to help bring the audience into this dire situation with Augustine and Iris?
From a sound effects point of view, certainly when he first wakes up in this chaos, it was a case really of trying to keep that pod scene feeling sort of confined and almost suffocating, and then feeling that openness when we get outside. And certainly from the Atmos surround side of things, that certainly enables a lot more room sonically, because we were dealing with a full bucket of sound for that whole sequence. So,
and panning, I mean, really, Todd's panning plays the biggest part, enabling the score to play, because not only is he picking and choosing which sounds play, it's where they play in the theater that allows the room for the score to, kind of still get in there. Because when you've got a snowmobile and ice cracking and all that, that's not really string friendly material.
Because this was for Netflix, was it a Dolby Home Atmos mix, or did you guys mix this? Was it a theatrical Dolby Atmos mix?
It was all formats on this one. It had a theatrical release that probably ended up mostly at drive-ins, but we had a full theatrical Atmos, and then I believe we did 27 versions in 27 different formats. So it's full theatrical release and then a full Netflix palette as well, which is never ending.
Cool, yeah. See, there was another really great scene after that. So after we just go through this whole dramatic thing with Augustine and Iris, then we're aboard the Ether with that crew, and they encounter an ice field or an asteroid field, and their ship gets bombarded by these massive impacts. I love that the ship's hull is flexible, and that these chunks of space debris just bounce right off.
What is it? I can't pull it up on radar. On this axis,
trying now.
What the hell is that?
That's what happens when you fly in the goddamn dark.
Mission Specialist Sullivan, do you copy? Hello?
Lake Hazen, can you hear me? Lake Hazen, do you copy?
We wanted to tip our hats to this notion that sound doesn't get transmitted when you're out in space. So the impacts of the asteroids, which were made of lots of elements, I would say mainly very large boulders crashing into various kinds of objects. We couldn't really throw large boulders through the air, but we rolled them down hills and let them collide with various things. But then to tailor them to use in this sequence, we muffled them to some degree. When we're on the outside of the spaceship, they're much more muffled than they might have normally been. And we were hoping that the audience would get the impression that that's the effect of not being able to hear in space. And so what you're hearing is a combination of what the astronauts are, when they're outside of the spaceship, are kind of picking up through their bodies and what they're hearing through their communication system. And then, of course, the same sounds when we're inside, the asteroids hitting the outside of the ship would naturally be muffled when we're inside.
So in terms of the mix, you mean you have big music, big effects, dialogue happening in that sequence. How were you able to make it all work?
Well, it's tricky when you're trying to put an effect, you're trying to sell an effect on something like Randy's speaking to, with a sound in space, but yet the sequence still has to play big action and, have its impact on the film. So, similar to the pod scene, it's really a lot of just kind of bobbing and weaving and finding the right spots to feature things, and, going through the score and having to pick what you really need at what point in order to make room for the sound effects. And, Todd back and forth with the same thing, trying to find places to give the music room. And I think they did that a lot by not using a ton of sound when things are flying through space and featuring more of the impact. So you're able to kind of let everything show through there.
Yeah, we were definitely afforded, or at least aided by the fact that George wasn't focused on here, with sound for absolutely everything. So again, there was a little bit of there was space to work with, so that, when we did play things, I feel like they're impactful, but not take you out of what's happening.
And so let's talk about the spacewalk, of course. Design-wise, what did you want that experience to sound like for this film? You kind of touched on it a little bit, but could you elaborate?
Yeah, we wanted the audience to feel, in a way, like they were inside those spacesuits and they were climbing around on the outside of the spaceship.
Oh my God. No view quite like it.
There's your radar.
Yep.
The installation site should be coming up.
I see it.
$25 meters.
20 meters?
Got eyes on the antenna site.
So the Foley, for instance, as the characters are moving on the outside of the spaceship, grabbing things, touching things, lifting things, is all relatively muffled and bass heavy, as if the astronauts are, literally kind of hearing the sound being transmitted through their bones into their ears. And that's a tricky thing to do, because it's not the way we are normally used to hearing things, and so you usually have to introduce an effect or a style like that fairly carefully, so it's not too shocking, which we tried to do.
And I must say, my favorite part of that sequence is probably when the blood appears first in her helmet, and you don't realize how much sound Todd's playing out there with the music while they're floating around and all that, until you have to get rid of it all to make a moment. And as she comes around and realizes that, and that blood starts to come through her helmet, and she started to realize, and just the whole outside world goes away, all the hums from the ship, everything just really tried to get it as smooth as we could to just slowly disappear, so you don't realize all of a sudden all you're really hearing is her breathing in that helmet. And that's just the key to that sequence, is being in that helmet with her, feeling just claustrophobic and panicked, and hopefully that came across.
And the breathing sounds, was that something that you were able to take from production, or is that something that you guys created in post?
I think in that sequence was someplace where we used some group and stuff like that, but so many places in the film, Danny Hambrook did an amazing job on the production track. And again, when you're talking in those sequences where you have dialogue and so much going on, that to have a great dialogue track to work around is just such a luxury, because you've got a nice full track to bob and weave around. So when you are able to clear it, it plays really nicely. And we had that luxury in so many scenes in the film, that most of the stuff outside in the storm it's all production recording. I mean, he just did an absolutely amazing job, and I think we spent a fair amount of the time on the stage during the mix trying to figure out just how he was able to get those recordings.
Well, there's no like wind noise or snow.
There was tons to deal with, but it all worked out.
That's cool. That's great. So for the spacewalk sounds, was this something, the sound of being in space and hearing the sounds travel through the suit, was that something that you achieved mostly through recording techniques, or did that also involve processing, like on the dub stage? Were you EQing and filtering these sounds?
It was mostly processing. We recorded all the Foley, flat, without much processing at all, partly because we weren't sure whether George would ultimately want to go with this kind of muffled treatment or not. So if we had painted ourselves into a corner by recording it all muffled, we might have gotten ourselves in trouble. So yeah, it was mostly processing, but the Foley performers also knew that there was this idea that we were going to go with this muffled, distanced sound, and so I think it did affect the way they performed touching and moving certain objects.
Yeah, I've got to say that even in the tent mix, we put this stuff up that Randy and his guys created, and immediately Dan and I were taken back. I mean, just as it came to us, it was stirring. And so, and the beauty of it is of course, George was thoroughly impressed, and it allowed us to play to try to further enhance that. But a great example of well prepared and just creatively smart tracks that enable you time to create on the stage, as opposed to starting from square one sort of thing.
And what was in the processing chain for this spacewalk sound?
I wish I could say it was something really complicated and impressive. Oh yeah, like 25 or 30 plugins. I can't even begin to explain. But I have to be honest and say that it was a filter, a low-pass filter.
Didn't send John Rush to space and record him.
No, we didn't. Yeah, John Rush and Shelley Roden were our Foley performers, and they did a fantastic job.
And I think that's one of the things we all kind of took to this movie, was to keep it has kind of an old school feel to it, and we wanted to keep that in the mix. And a lot of the vocal processing is old fashioned film frames, just delaying it with film frames and not using some fancy plugin to get it. Sometimes just the simplest effect is the most effective, and when George gets used to something and likes the way it works, you kind of have to stay close to that. And we ended up sticking with a lot of just real basic processing techniques, but when they work, they work.
So did you guys have a favorite scene in terms of sound, and what went into it?
What's your favorite, Randy?
I don't know. I have several favorites. I like the scene in which Augustine comes out of the observatory and discovers the dying birds, partly because that was a nice opportunity for us to do something, fun and dramatic with the sound effects. What's your favorite, Todd?
I mean, as you were talking, I thought, there are just a lot of moments, but we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about that processing that was done to George's voice to play the flashback Augustine. That was amazing.
Yeah, we had the thing that kind of had us worried most, actually, about the sound in the movie was the young Augustine. George Clooney, of course, plays the older Augustine, and Ethan Peck happens to be Gregory Peck's son, played the younger Augustine, who's perhaps 30 years old or in his 30s, and it was a conundrum because we needed the young Augustine to sound enough like George Clooney so that you'd believe that he was a younger version of George Clooney in a sense. But we tried having George do that voice, replace Ethan's voice, and it seemed odd to have exactly the same voice do both characters. And so what we really needed was a combination of George Clooney's voice and Ethan Peck's voice. And we also tried, by the way, bringing in voice alikes. We tried pitch changing, all the usual techniques, and nothing seemed to work. And finally, it occurred to me that a colleague was doing some very advanced work in using artificial intelligence to manipulate voices. And so I got in touch with him, and what you hear in the film is quite literally a combination of George Clooney's voice and Ethan Peck's voice. The result of AI and deep learning that analyzed both voices very, very precisely. And so that the result is a combination that has some elements of George Clooney's voice and some elements of Ethan Peck's voice. And when we all heard it, including George, we all said, wow, that's it.
Wow, that's fantastic. When will this technology be available to the rest of the world?
Right.
It's a little scary. Technology like that has its pluses. It certainly saved us in this instance, but it also scares me a little bit in terms of what can be done with it. It's the kind of thing we need to be careful about.
Yes, the implications of that.
And I got to say, my favorite scene in the film has to be the once they bring her in from the spacewalk and they're inside trying to resuscitate her. And, we just made a conscious decision to stay with the two girls' voices kind of throughout that scene and make sure that no matter where the camera goes, where we go, we never lose the presence of her trying to keep her alive. And then when the helmet comes off and the difference in the voices and the way that the score just finishes it off at the end, it's like a big release. And I just really thought that came out really well.
And visually, it's such a stunning sequence also. I don't think it had ever occurred to anybody to have, globules of blood floating in
really
no gravity situation. It's really an amazing thing to see.
So every project offers a unique opportunity to do something different and to explore your craft more. What were the opportunities that Midnight Sky afforded you in that area?
I mean, pretty boundless. I mean, we've been off for quite a time because of this pandemic. So to jump in on an Atmos theatrical mix with George Clooney, space, blizzards, the whole deal. There was really, it was a chance to just flex everything. We didn't have a 60 plugins we were using, but it was just a lot of creative mixing. It felt like, the tracks, just the way they came, afforded you all the time in the world to just play and get some perspective. And of course, the movie itself seemed to just lead you and afford you the ability to not just, you weren't making a track that's just hammering people over the head and it's deafening. And so it was just a lot of fun. Great experience.
Yeah, for me, to have George Clooney's voice to work with and amazing score and the orchestra and the time to put everything together was just a great opportunity. And when you work with George and he's so open to letting you just go for it and give him everything you got, and then he takes it from there and decides what, kind of what works and what doesn't. And it's a unique experience working with a director like that makes decisions, and how he directs himself and acts and then is so objective on his decision making all the way through the post process is really something to see.
I think using AI and experimenting with AI and sound is certainly the newest thing that I tried on this movie, and it's something that we'll be doing a lot more of. And I'm just really happy that it worked as well as it did.
Awesome. Well, that was all of my questions. Randy, Dan, Todd, thank you guys so much for having this chat with me, and best of luck this award season.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our pleasure.